Can you imagine an icy desert where a single mistake in building a fire means certain death? What if I told you that everything we have been taught about survival in extreme conditions is but a pale shadow of the ancient knowledge possessed by the indigenous peoples of North America? For the warriors and hunters of the Lakota, Cree, and Iroquois, fire in a snowstorm was not just a convenience, but the only barrier separating life from icy oblivion. They did not have the modern waterproof matches, lighters, or chemical igniters that we take for granted. Their arsenal consisted of wood, stone, dry grass, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the laws of nature. Honed over millennia, they knew how to find dryness where everything was wet and how to produce flames from friction or sparks in conditions that seem completely hopeless to us today. Watch the video to the end to find out what secret materials and invisible resources allowed them to light a fire during a snowstorm, and how one method gave them warmth and light when everything around them was covered in ice. What if I told you that everything you believed about survival priorities isn't entirely true? We are used to thinking that shelter or food are the most important things in extreme situations. But for peoples living in harmony with the harsh winter, fire was of paramount importance. Fire was not just a source of heat, it was a psychological barrier against the all-consuming chaos of a snowstorm. The flame in the center of a teepee or wigwam became the only point of stability in a world plunged into darkness and howling winds. That is why the knowledge of how to light a fire in any conditions, even the most impossible ones, was valued above all else. We often overlook the fact that the real enemy in a snowstorm is not so much the cold itself as the pervasive dampness. The moisture carried by wet snow soaks through clothing, furs, and moccasins, turning them into icy shackles that draw heat from the body at a catastrophic rate. Dry cold can be endured, but wet cold is an invisible and merciless enemy. The only weapon against this deadly dampness was fire, capable of drying clothes, warming the body, and restoring a sense of control over the situation. Fire was also the only reliable source of light during the endless nights of the subarctic winter, or during the multi-day blizzards on the Great Plains. A snowstorm erases the horizon, turning the world into a blinding white-gray haze in which all landmarks are lost. The flames of a campfire pierce this monotonous veil, restoring volume, shadows, and color to the world. It allowed people to continue working, repair equipment, or simply see the faces of their fellow tribesmen, maintaining social ties and morale. The ability to quickly and efficiently light a fire in a storm was not just a useful skill, but a fundamental indicator of competence and wisdom. A person who mastered this art enjoyed immense respect in the community. This knowledge was not innate. It was the result of decades of observation, trial and error, passed down from generation to generation. From an early age, children were taught to recognize the right materials, feel the moisture in wood, and understand the language of the wind. For many indigenous cultures, fire also had a deep spiritual meaning. It was considered a living and sacred entity, a direct gift from the Creator. The process of obtaining it was a ritual that required not only technical skills, but also the right attitude, respect, and patience. The smoke rising from the fire carried prayers and gratitude to the spirits, connecting the world of humans with the world of higher powers. Failure to light a fire could be perceived not only as a technical failure, but also as a sign of spiritual discord. The pressure associated with the need to obtain fire was enormous, because the lives of loved ones depended on it. This formed a special attitude towards the materials used for kindling. The most valuable resource, which was always carried in special waterproof bags, was tinder. This small bundle of dry, flammable fibers was more valuable than any prey because it was the key to life. Modern thinking about survival often focuses on sophisticated gadgets and equipment, but ancient peoples relied on something more reliable: their knowledge. They understood that fire is not something you take with you, but something you create from your surroundings. This approach required constant vigilance and foresight. They gathered dry materials not when they were needed, but when they could be found, constantly replenishing their supply. The process of preparing for winter was largely a process of collecting and preserving potential fire. This meant not only gathering large logs for fuel, but also carefully collecting tinder, resin, and dry kindling. They created stores of dry materials inside their dwellings, knowing that when a storm came, it would be virtually impossible to go outside and find anything suitable. This foresight was the basis of their resilience. It is also important to understand that fire was not only for warmth, but also for making tools and cooking food. It allowed them to process and preserve food, making it safe and accessible during the long winter months. The tips of wooden spears were hardened over the fire, making them as hard as stone. Without fire, all technology and life-sustaining culture came to a halt. Thus, the psychology of fire in a snowstorm is the psychology of hope and control. The flame was proof that human ingenuity and willpower could withstand the harshest forces of nature. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. Which function of fire do you think was more important to ancient humans, physical or psychological? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn more about the wisdom of indigenous peoples. Are you ready to learn the truth about what was actually the most valuable and protected resource in the winter forest? It was not fur, food, or weapons, but a modest yet vital bundle of tinder. It was this small bundle of dry fibers that was the starting point, the spark that determined the difference between life and death in an icy blizzard. Obtaining tinder in conditions where everything around was covered with snow and ice was a real art that required deep knowledge and observation. One of the most valuable materials for tinder, especially in the northern forests where the Cree and Iroquois lived, was birch bark. Thin as paper, layers of birch bark contain natural oils that make it waterproof and highly flammable. Even if the tree trunk was wet on the outside, completely dry strips could be found under the peeling layers. Birch bark burns brightly and hotly, making it an ideal material for igniting damp kindling. Indigenous peoples treated the collection of birch bark with great respect, never damaging the tree unnecessarily. They took only those layers that the tree was already ready to give up, the peeling, paper-like scraps. They also actively used bark from fallen trees. The collected birch bark was carefully dried and stored in waterproof bags so that it was always ready for use when needed. Another invaluable source of tinder was a lichen known as old man's beard, or usnea. This lichen, which hangs from the branches of old trees, especially conifers, has the amazing ability to dry quickly. Even after heavy rain or snowfall, it was enough to pick a bunch and shake it a few times to get rid of most of the moisture. Its thin, web-like structure was ideal for catching the slightest spark. In the open spaces of the Great Plains, where trees were scarce, Lakota or Cheyenne hunters relied on other materials. They used dry, crushed grass found in places sheltered from wind and snow, such as under thick bushes or at the base of rocks. They also used the fluff of certain plants, such as cattails, whose seeds were enclosed in dense brown cigars. This fluff was incredibly flammable, but it had to be collected dry. The most important method was not just to find tinder, but to prepare it. The peoples of the eastern forests, such as the Iroquois, skillfully processed the inner layer of the bark of certain trees, such as cedar or linden. This bark was removed from fallen trees, soaked, and then kneaded and rubbed with the hands or beaten with wooden mallets until it turned into a soft, fluffy mass similar to cotton wool. Such tinder was not only dry, but also had the ideal texture for friction. Another secret ingredient was tinder fungi, which grow on tree trunks. Some species, after proper processing, turned into what we now call tinder fungus. Its flesh was boiled, dried, and kneaded to obtain a material that does not burn but smolders. It was invaluable for the method of striking sparks, as it could catch and hold even the weakest spark, turning it into a stable ember. The main secret was foresight. Tinder was never collected when it was needed. It was gathered in dry weather, in summer and autumn, and carefully preserved. Every hunter, when leaving camp, carried a personal fire kit. It was usually stored in a pouch made of leather or waterproof material, ensuring that, no matter what happened, he would have a chance to start a fire. This kit often contained several types of tinder, each for its own purpose. For example, fluffy grass tinder for quick ignition from friction, and dense mushroom tinder for catching sparks from stones. This duplication of systems and materials was key to survival. They did not rely on a single method. understanding that nature is too unpredictable. The process of creating a nest for the tinder was also important. It was not just a shapeless lump. The best, finest, and driest material was placed in the very center. Rough, but still dry fibers were laid around it to catch the flame from the center. The whole structure resembled a bird's nest, protecting the precious spark and giving it space to grow. Collecting tinder was a continuous process, built into everyday life. Walking through the forest, a person would automatically note fallen trees with dry bark, thickets of cattail, or suitable lichens. Which part of this process of collecting and preparing tinder seems to you the most difficult and time-consuming in the face of approaching winter? But even the perfect tinder is useless if there is no way to light it. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret that allows you to get fire when everything around you is wet, using only pine fat. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival in a damp forest, one that you may never have heard of. What should you do if your tinder is damp and your kindling is wet from snow? The indigenous peoples of the subarctic and eastern forests knew the answer. They used natural accelerants for burning, the most powerful of which was the resin of coniferous trees. It was their secret weapon against moisture, a true natural gasoline. Pine, spruce, or fir resin is essentially a concentrated, energy-rich substance that trees use to heal wounds. This viscous liquid is incredibly flammable and, most importantly, waterproof. Even in the heaviest rain or snowfall, lumps of frozen resin on a tree trunk remain dry inside. They burn for a long time and release very high temperatures, capable of drying and igniting even damp kindling. Searching for resin was part of the routine patrol of the territory. Hunters and gatherers knew where to look for wounded trees, those that had been damaged by wind or other natural processes. They collected both fresh, sticky resin and old, hardened amber-colored lumps. This resource was so valuable that it was often stored together with tinder, rolled into small balls for easy transport. But the real treasure of the forest was what is called fatwood, or resinous wood. This is not just wood with resin on the surface, but wood completely saturated with it. It was most often found in the stumps of long-fallen pine trees, especially where the trunk joined the roots. Over time, the ordinary wood around it decayed, but the resin-soaked core remained almost eternal, hard as stone and smelling of turpentine. This fat tree was an absolute miracle for kindling a fire. It could literally be dug out from under the snow or broken out of a rotten stump, and it was ready to use. It didn't require much effort. All you had to do was shave off small chips with a stone or bone knife. These chips were so saturated with fuel that they could be lit with a single spark and burned as brightly as a candle, even on wet snow. The use of resin and fat wood completely changed the strategy of building a fire. They served as a bridge between the tiny, weak spark of tinder and the large, heat-intensive kindling. When the tinder began to smolder, a pinch of resin chips was immediately placed on top of it. It flared up instantly, producing a powerful, hot flame that could already handle the thin, albeit slightly damp twigs. This knowledge was especially important for subarctic peoples, such as the Koryaks, who lived in the eternal taiga, where coniferous trees were everywhere. They developed a whole system for using these resources. For example, they could use torches made of fat wood for lighting or for carrying fire from one camp to another, as this wood burned very long and reliably. This method also demonstrates a deep understanding of forest chemistry. Indigenous peoples did not just see trees, they saw them as a pharmacy, a tool shed, and, in this case, a fuel depot. They knew exactly which tree produced the best resin, where to find it, and how it would behave in a fire. This knowledge was the result of thousands of years of empirical observation and experimentation. Unlike simple tinder, which could burn out quickly, resin and fat wood provided burn time. This was critically important in a snowstorm. A person had not just one chance, but several minutes while this natural accelerant burned to calmly and methodically add larger and larger branches, building a full-fledged fire. This relieved enormous psychological pressure. This non-standard approach, focusing on the chemical properties of wood rather than just mechanical friction, was the key to their success. It exceeded all my expectations of how complex and sophisticated their technology was. If you are also surprised by this natural chemistry and how it solved the problem of survival, don't forget to like this video and support our channel. What if everything you've been taught about starting a fire with friction is just the tip of the iceberg? We often imagine this process as simply rubbing two sticks together, but in reality it was a complex and precise technology, comparable in accuracy to the workings of a clock mechanism. The most common and effective method of friction, especially in the harsh conditions of the north, was the bow drill. This system consisted of several key components, each of which had to be made to perfection. The first element was the bow itself. It was a simple curved stick, not too elastic, with a string made of leather or tendon. Its sole purpose was to provide rotation. The bowstring was wrapped once around the drill, and the horizontal back and forth movements of the bow were converted into rapid rotation with a mechanical advantage unattainable by the palms alone. The second and perhaps most important element was the drill. It was a straight, perfectly dried stick made of medium-hard wood, such as cedar, willow, or poplar. Its ends had to be perfectly rounded. One, thinner, rested against the board, the other, thicker, against the pressure. The entire system depended on the quality of the drill. If it was crooked or damp, nothing would work. The third component was the board, or hearth. It was a flat piece of wood that was softer than the drill bit and also completely dry. A small recess was cut into it for the drill bit. A V-shaped notch was cut into the side of this recess. It was in this notch, protected from the wind, that the hot wood dust was to collect, which would then become charcoal. The fourth element was the pressure. It was a small piece of very hard material that a person held in their hand and pressed down on the drill. It could be a piece of stone with a natural recess, a shell, or a dense piece of wood. Its task was to provide constant, strong downward pressure to maximize friction. Sometimes this depression was lubricated to reduce friction at the upper end of the drill. The technique required practice and skill. The person would kneel on one knee, pressing the board to the ground with their foot. With his left hand, if he was right-handed, he took the pressure and pressed hard on the drill, holding it vertically. With his right hand, he quickly moved the bow back and forth, perpendicular to the drill. This required coordination and endurance. As a result of friction, the drill bit not only heated up, but also began to char and grind the wood of the board into fine black dust. This dust fell through a V-shaped notch onto a piece of bark or dry leaf placed underneath. As the speed and pressure increased, the dust began to smoke, and at some point, when it reached the ignition temperature, it burst into flames, turning into a tiny smoldering ember. This method was brilliant for wet conditions. Even if the surface of the board and drill bit was slightly damp, the intense friction quickly dried the points of contact. The process itself created ideal dry conditions, generating dry, hot dust from the inner drier layers of the wood. This was its main advantage over other methods. In drier southern regions, such as the Great Plains, the hand drill method was sometimes used. It was simpler in design, just a drill and a board, but it was much more physically demanding, requiring incredibly fast rotational movements of the palms with simultaneous, strong downward pressure. In freezing conditions, when hands quickly become numb, this method was almost impossible. The ember itself, obtained by either method of friction, was incredibly fragile. It was not yet fire, but only its seed. The entire process, from the start of rotation to the production of an ember, could take several minutes of intense, exhausting work. But it was work that gave life. It was real engineering, based on a deep understanding of physics, friction, and the properties of materials. Which of these two friction methods, the hand drill or the bow drill, do you think is more inventive from a mechanical point of view? But obtaining that small piece of charcoal was only half the battle. In the next chapter, we will learn how that smoldering piece of dust was turned into a roaring flame. Obtaining a smoldering ember, whether from striking pyrite or rotating a bow drill, was the culmination of intense work, but it was still far from fire. This fragile, smoldering lump of black dust was the coveted goal, but it was incredibly vulnerable. It could be extinguished by a strong gust of wind, a drop of meltwater, or an awkward movement. The next stage required not strength, but delicacy, patience, and pre-prepared materials. The ember itself, smoldering on a board or a piece of Tinder fungus, was too small to ignite even the thinnest twig. It needed to be fed. To do this, it was carefully transferred, often with the tip of a knife, or a thin stick, to a pre-prepared nest made of the best tinder. This nest was the center of the entire lighting operation. This nest of tinder, which we talked about in Chapter 2, was a fluffy ball of dry grass, fluffed up inner cedar bark or lichen. The precious ember was placed in a small depression in the very center of the nest. Then the edges of the nest were carefully but tightly wrapped around the ember, creating a kind of cigar or roll. This insulated the ember from cold air and moisture. Now came the most crucial moment, turning smoldering embers into flames. The person would take the bundle in both hands, bring it to their mouth, and begin to blow on it very carefully, slowly and evenly. The oxygen from their breath caused the coals inside the nest to smolder hotter and hotter. It was a delicate balance. Breathing too weakly did not provide the necessary temperature, while breathing too strongly could blow out the ember or blow it out of the nest. As the man blew, the tinder around the coal began to smoke heavily, and the nest itself became hotter and hotter. The smoke became thicker and acrid, which was a sure sign that the flame was approaching. The person continued to blow, gradually increasing the intensity until finally, the compressed and heated tinder burst into an open, bright flame right in their hands. This moment was triumphant, but also dangerous. The man now held a burning ball of dry grass in his hands. It had to be used immediately before it burned out. Before starting the whole process, a pile of the finest kindling had to be prepared nearby. Dry twigs, resinous shavings, or dry needles. The burning nest was immediately placed under this pile of kindling. The flames eagerly devoured the new dry material. Now the task was to quickly, but without fuss, add larger and larger branches. First, twigs as thick as a match, then as thick as a pencil, and only then as thick as a finger. This sequence was critically important. Attempting to add a branch that was too thick or too wet at this stage was a fatal mistake. It would only smother the young flame, depriving it of heat and oxygen. Indigenous peoples understood this process of heat accumulation. Each subsequent portion of fuel had to be only slightly larger than the previous one so that the fire could grow organically and confidently. The entire process, from transferring the ember to obtaining a stable flame, took only a minute or two, but required complete concentration. It had to be done flawlessly the first time. In a snowstorm, there might not be a second chance. The drilling board could get wet and the tinder could run out. It was a real dance with fire, a sacred ritual in which a person acted as a midwife, helping the flame to be born. It required not only knowledge, but also a deep feel for fire. It was necessary to intuitively understand how much air to give, when to add a new twig, how to protect the flame from a gust of wind. This art of transforming invisible smoldering into visible flame was at the heart of the whole process. It separated those who would survive from those who would freeze. Success meant warmth, dry clothes, hot food, and life itself. Failure meant a quick and quiet extinction in the icy desert. Want to know a secret that is more important than the best tinder and the fastest friction technique? 50% of the success of starting a fire in a blizzard depended not on how it was lit, but on where it was lit. Choosing the right sheltered location was the first and most important strategic decision made by an experienced survivalist, whether a Cree hunter in the taiga or a Comanche warrior on the plains. It was pointless and almost impossible to light a fire in an open space exposed to the wind. Wind is the main enemy of a young fire. It blows away precious heat, extinguishes sparks, and scatters tinder. Therefore, the first task was to find natural shelter that could serve as a windshield. The ideal place was a dense group of coniferous trees, such as spruce or fir. Their low-hanging, snow-covered branches created an almost impenetrable barrier to the wind, forming a quiet, sheltered space under their crowns. The snow on the branches also served as a roof, protecting the area from falling snow. If there were no dense trees, the next best option was the base of a large rock, ledge, boulder, or steep riverbank. Any vertical barrier could break up the wind and create a relatively calm area on the leeward side. It was important to position oneself close enough to the shelter to be protected, but far enough away so that the smoke could rise. In the open Great Plains, where there were no trees or rocks, the task was more difficult. Here, people used the features of the terrain, dry creek beds, ravines, or small hollows. Any depression in the ground, even a small one, could provide protection from the icy wind that swept unhindered across the plain. Once a suitable place was found, the second stage of preparation began, creating a hearth. No one lit a fire directly on the surface of deep snow. That would have been a disaster. The heat from the fire would have melted the snow beneath it, and the fire would have simply fallen into the icy water and gone out. First, they had to clear the snow down to the ground. To do this, they used snowshoes, pieces of bark, or simply their hands. The snow was trampled down and thrown aside, creating a pit or platform with a diameter of at least 1.5 meters. If it was impossible to reach the ground due to the depth of the snow, it was trampled down very tightly, creating a platform as hard as ice. A foundation of wet or thick logs was laid on this platform or on the bare ground. These logs served as insulation, raising the fire above the cold, damp surface. They could smoke and hiss, but they prevented the heat from the fire from escaping downward, directing it upward toward the kindling and fuel. An additional wind barrier was often built around the cleared area. Fir branches were stuck into the snow on the windward side, or a wall of discarded snow was built. This simple snow wall, only 0.5 meter high, could radically change the situation, creating almost ideal windless conditions for kindling. Only after the location had been chosen, the site cleared, the foundation laid, and the windbreak built did the person take out their precious fire-starting kit. All this preparation could take a long time, but it ensured that a tiny ember would have a chance to turn into a life-saving flame. It was a methodical, thoughtful, and unhurried process. Which of these preparatory steps, finding shelter or creating a platform, do you think was more important for success? Preparing the site was vital, but it was useless without fuel. In the next chapter, we will learn how they have found dry firewood in a forest where everything seemed wet. Once the site had been chosen and prepared, the most labor-intensive part began, gathering fuel. In a snowstorm, this task seemed impossible because everything on the ground was covered with a thick layer of wet snow or frozen into ice. Using such firewood was pointless. All the energy of the fire would be spent not on heat, but on evaporating the moisture from it. Indigenous peoples knew this and never took firewood from the ground. Their golden rule was, look for fuel at eye level and above. They looked for what is called dead standing trees or dead wood. These were trees that had died but remained standing upright. The wind and sun had long since dried out their wood, and the lack of contact with damp ground had preserved them from decay. Such a tree, even after standing under snowfall, remained dry inside. The lower dead branches of living conifers, such as spruce or pine trees, were especially prized. The dense crown above them served as a natural umbrella, protecting these branches from rain and snow. They often broke off under their own weight or from the wind and hung without touching the ground. These dry, resin-soaked branches were ideal kindling. Finding such a tree in a storm, when visibility was limited, was not easy. It required excellent knowledge of the forest. Hunters would note such dead trees in their territory in advance, in good weather, memorizing their location. They were a kind of fuel depot left by nature itself. When a suitable tree was found, it had to be felled or broken into branches. Without metal axes or saws, this was a difficult task. Sometimes a small dry tree could be felled simply by leaning on it with all one's weight. If it was stronger, they used the method of burning at the base, but this was only possible if they already had a fire. Most often, they relied on leverage. They looked for branches that were already broken but still hanging, known as widow's branches. This was dangerous, but such branches were already almost ready to fall. They could also use heavy stones to hit the trunk of a small dry tree at the base until it broke. The collected branches and trunks were never put directly into the fire. They were brought to a prepared area and sorted. The thinnest, driest twigs were set aside for kindling. Thicker branches and logs were first placed around the future fire so that they could dry out from its heat before being thrown into the flames. It was a conveyor belt for drying fuel. In the forests of the East Coast, the Iroquois valued hardwoods such as oak, maple, or hickory, walnut. They burned longer and gave off more heat than softwoods, but they were harder to find dry and more difficult to break. Conifers, rich in resin, caught fire more easily but burned faster, producing more smoke. The process of gathering firewood was continuous. It did not end once the fire was lit. On the contrary, as soon as the first fire appeared, the main task was to create a supply of dry fuel for the night or for the entire duration of the storm. People took turns leaving the fire to find and bring more wood while they still had light and warmth. Their knowledge of different types of wood was encyclopedic. They knew which wood produced good charcoal for cooking, which burned with almost no smoke, important for the dwelling, and which burst into flames with a crackle, scattering sparks. In a snowstorm, the main criteria were dryness and accessibility. This strategy of vertical fuel collection was a fundamental difference between an experienced survivalist and a novice. A novice would try in vain to light wet logs from the ground, while an experienced person would look up and find the perfect fuel hanging right above their head. Lighting a fire was only the beginning. To be useful and stay lit, it had to be built correctly. The type of fire or its architecture depended on the purpose. Whether a quick fire was needed to boil water, a long and hot fire for heating, or a slow and smoky fire for other needs. Indigenous peoples knew dozens of ways to stack firewood, but in a snowstorm, the most important ones were those that provided maximum heat and were protected from the wind. The first and most important structure was the teepee fire. This is how kindling was stacked around a burning tinder. Thin, dry twigs were placed in the shape of a cone or a teepee, leaving a small opening on the windward side for air to flow in. This shape was ingenious. The flame that started at the bottom naturally rushed upward, consuming more and more fuel and concentrating the heat in the center. This conical shape created natural draft, drawing cold air in from below and expelling hot air upward. This allowed the fire to quickly reach a temperature sufficient to ignite larger and possibly slightly damp logs, which were placed outside the teepee. It was a quick start fire, ideal for securing success after ignition. Once the basic teepee fire was burning and had created a good layer of coals, it could be modified. For long-term heating in a winter camp, a well or log cabin fire was often used. 2 logs were placed parallel to each other, and 2 more were placed across them. This continued, building a square box out of logs. The fire burned inside this well. This design was very effective. It protected the coals from wind and snow, allowing them to smolder for a very long time and burn hot. At the same time, air flowed freely through the gaps between the logs, ensuring good combustion. Such a fire was stable, did not require constant attention, and provided a lot of even upward heat, ideal for cooking or heating a small shelter. But the most important thing for survival in a snowstorm was a reflective fire. By itself, fire radiates heat in all directions, and most of it is wasted going up and to the sides. To fix this, indigenous peoples built a heat reflector. It was a simple but incredibly effective design. On one side of the fire, where there was no natural shelter, rocks or fallen trees, a vertical wall was built out of thick logs or stones. This wall prevented the heat from escaping. It captured the infrared radiation from the fire and reflected it back toward the person or shelter. Starting a fire in a storm was a feat, but keeping it going throughout a long, freezing night or a multi-day blizzard was no less difficult. Constantly adding wood would quickly deplete all supplies and deprive people of sleep, which was unacceptable in a survival situation. Therefore, indigenous peoples were masters not so much of burning as of smoldering. They controlled not the flames but the coals. The key to a long-lasting fire was to create a large and deep layer of hot coals. It is the coals, not the open flame, that retain most of the heat. To achieve this, they used thicker and denser logs, preferably from hardwoods. These logs did not burn quickly, but slowly charred, turning into long-lasting sources of heat. When it was necessary to keep the fire burning overnight, it was preserved or banked. To do this, the fire was allowed to burn down to a state of large, smoldering coals. These coals were then raked into a dense pile in the center of the hearth. They were covered with a thick layer of ash, which served as an insulator. This layer of ash limited the access of oxygen, preventing the coals from burning out quickly, but also preventing them from going out. Sometimes sawdust or even dry earth was used instead of ash, if it was available. A single, very thick, slightly damp log could be placed on top of this buried pile of coals. It would slowly dry out and smolder, keeping the coals beneath it alive. Such a preserved fire could smolder unattended for many hours until morning. In the morning, the process was reversed. The person carefully raked away the layer of ash, revealing the smoldering heart of the fire. The coals under the ashes were still hot. All that was needed was to put a little dry tinder or small kindling on them and blow gently. The fire would instantly flare up again, saving a huge amount of time and effort that would otherwise have been spent on rekindling it from scratch. In dwellings such as teepee on the plains or Iroquois longhouses, fires were rarely extinguished at all. It was kept burning constantly and was usually tended by women. They were the keepers of the hearth in both the literal and figurative sense. They knew exactly when to throw on a log, how to move the coals to get more heat for cooking, or how to dampen the fire for the night. Managing the fire also included managing the fuel. As we have already mentioned, the wood brought from the forest was damp. It was not thrown into the fire immediately. There was always a drying area around the hearth. Wet logs were placed at a distance from the flames so that the heat of the fire would gradually evaporate the moisture from them. As they dried, they were moved closer and closer, and by the time they reached the fire, they were already dry. Although the basic principles of fire, heat, fuel, oxygen, are universal, the methods of obtaining and using it varied greatly depending on the landscape. Geography dictated the rules. The skills that were vital to a Cree hunter in the dense, snow-covered taiga were very different from those required by a Lakota warrior in the open, windswept prairie. A comparison of these two approaches reveals the full depth of the adaptability of indigenous peoples. The peoples of the eastern woods and subarctic, such as the Iroquois and Athabascans, lived in a world of abundant wood. Their main problem was not a lack of fuel, but its moisture content. The snow-covered forest was full of firewood, but almost all of it was wet. Therefore, their technology focused on combating dampness, searching for fatwood, using waterproof birch bark, and collecting deadwood. Their methods of kindling were adapted to this environment. The bow drill was ideal because it dried the wood itself through friction. The use of tinder fungus to catch sparks from pyrite was also characteristic of the forest zone, as these fungi grew in abundance on fallen trees. Their fires were large and hot, often using reflective walls to maximize the heat from the abundant fuel. In the forest, the main protection from storms was the trees themselves. People took shelter under dense spruce trees, built fires on a foundation of logs, and used the endless supply of dry lower branches. Their strategy was based on using the vertical resources of the forest. They lived in a three-dimensional space where fuel and shelter could be found overhead. In contrast, the peoples of the Great Plains, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, lived in a completely different world. It was a two-dimensional plain, open to all winds. There were catastrophically few trees, growing mainly in river valleys. The main problem here was not finding dry fuel, but finding fuel at all, and secondly, fighting the relentless, freezing wind. Anything that could burn was used as fuel on the plains. The main resource, especially in summer, was the dried dung of large herbivores. But in winter, when it was hidden under snow, they used shrub roots, dry stalks of tall grasses, and any driftwood they could find near frozen rivers. Wood was worth its weight in gold, and every fallen tree was a strategic resource. Due to the lack of fuel, their fires were completely different. They were small, efficient, and often built in pits. Digging a small pit for a fire was a key skill. The pit protected the flames from the wind, preventing them from burning out quickly, and concentrated the heat. It was an economical fire, intended not so much for heating the space as for cooking food and warming hands. We have examined in detail the ancient and wise methods that allowed the indigenous peoples of North America to obtain and maintain fire even in the most seemingly hopeless conditions of a snowstorm. It was not magic, but a profound science based on thousands of years of observation, perfect knowledge of materials, and respect for the forces of nature. From the psychological importance of fire to the collection of tinder, from the secrets of the fat tree to the mechanics of the bow drill, every element of this system was honed to perfection. What other aspects of the daily life or survival of the indigenous peoples of North America would you like to see in our future issues? Perhaps you are interested in methods of building winter dwellings, hunting techniques, or the art of navigating by the stars? Suggest your topics in the comments, And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into ancient wisdom.